All right. Welcome back to the SAML training to support team. This is intended to be the last section of the 3 parts. Today we're going to talk about troubleshooting. Well, if we do need more information and you guys interested in learning more, we could have a 4th part. But let's see how we go with part 3, troubleshooting. So now, and this is where you guys work most of the time on the SAML cases is our customers has problem, has questions. They try to set up single sign-on, but it's failing. What's happening? What can they do? Now, unfortunately, every service provider is going to have a different behavior and handling error when it comes to single sign-on. So our customer and ourselves included may see different things that service provider may give specific error messages, then that would be good news for us because we know exactly what's wrong. But in many other cases, service providers giving a unspecific or generic error message, which simply says SAML failed. There's some error in SAML response. Please contact your system admin. And in that case, that's not as useful. Besides, well, we only know the fact that it's failing. Now, for some applications, they don't even show any error message. They simply put the users back on the login page, and the user will be simply wondering what just happened. Why am I here? Right? But I can tell you that when that happens, it pretty much means single sign-on has failed. That's why the application put the user back just in case, right? You could still have the option to log in using your username and password. Now, I actually know some applications do intend, like by design, they do this. It's just that it's not too user-friendly because it didn't say single sign-on has failed, right? Now, so what we'll do in that case, right, when whatever we see on the screen, we know some single sign-on has failed, what can we do? The first thing I will ask you guys to do is actually to see who is showing that error message. Who here is this Centrify giving this message, or is the service provider giving that message? Very likely, just by looking at the screen, you can tell. Otherwise, look at the URL if it is still like within the tenant URL, right? my.kibble.centrify.com. If I'm still there and I'm getting an error message just like this one, I'm showing on this slide, even have the Centrify logo on it, that's an error message that Centrify sends out, right? Otherwise, if the workflow has actually reached to the service provider side, and you can once again tell on the screen or look at the URL that you can tell you're actually in the application sites, and if you get an error there, that's an error message that is given by service provider. Now, why that's important is because if the error is actually given by Centrify, that means the SAML workflow has actually stopped here. Centrify wouldn't move on to send out a SAML response to the ACS endpoint because, well, an error has occurred. So the first thing for us to do is really look at that error message and troubleshoot what is happening in Cloud Manager. Right? Something has happened. That's why it's not going through. And you look at the configuration of the whole applications, starting from application settings and then account mapping and then advanced script. Like I said before, when this happens, the SAML response will not be sent out. It has not been sent out because the workflow was terminated here. And why I'm pointing that out again is because if we want to look at the SAML response in this case, it's not even there. Even if we capture a network trace using any tool, you won't see it because of this error. So the first thing to do really is to get through this error. So let's look at the screenshot I have at the example, right? It says failed to launch this application. The reason is subject name is empty or white space. So this is a message telling you that some value is missing, right? That's why it is stopping there. Okay, now let's say we have gone through that part SAML response is being sent out, we reach service provider's ACS endpoint, but now we are getting error message or even nothing. So what do we do? Now, for those who have worked on enough SAML escalations, and with me particularly, we always at least just double check the configuration on both sides, right? Now on our side it's easier, right? You could even give me like read-only access. We can read that all day. Now it might be more difficult on the service provider side. It depends if they have an admin screen that you could also look at. They can show you their configuration values, then you could match them. If not, then it gets a little more difficult, right? Because we might have to even eventually contact the service provider support on their side to work with us, right, to see what was happening. But in my experience, many cases have been there's some only little misconfiguration. To be honest, I do think they are just honest mistake, but then one little thing that is off can throw this whole thing off. That's why double checking the configuration on both sides is the first thing to do. And even without looking at service provider side settings, we could still run network trace to see what is coming out from their end. That only applies to SP-initiated single sign-on, but when they do send us something, there might be some useful information inside that SAML request that will give us some good idea about what the configuration should be. Okay. Now let's say when we have done it, we run it again and it's still not working. Then what's next? The next thing would be to look at the account mapping. We talked about that in the last session, right? SAML configuration, so setting up the entity ID, login URL, ACS URL, all the good stuff. But eventually, what should the identity be in the SAML response, right? That has to be the actual username being used in the target application, right? So here comes account mapping and what AD attributes to use. That is the question. So during troubleshooting, right, we will ask that question. So what should the username be? Should it just be like a short name, like say TFOG, right? That's my name, by the way, if you guys don't know. Or the whole email address, terry.fog@centrify.com, right? Because in SAML application, by default, a application template may have configured to use mail address by default. But for that one company, they might have configured differently. They might actually use a short name rather than the email address. So we have to match that, right? So the specific pieces to look at here is, the first one is, of course, the account mapping screen, right? And we can also go to advanced and use the test button to see what value is coming out, right? Now, and in the network trace, you will see the same thing. What is the name ID value being sent out? And then with the question to the customer, is this the same username that you guys use to log in to that application, right?
Right.
Usually they have to match, unless there's some special setup in the service provider. But there are only very few number that says like we actually use email address, even though it is not what the user normally would configure. But that's special, but that could happen. Okay, so yeah, network trace of the whole SAML workflow will definitely give us a way better idea of what's happening right now. SAML response, definitely, and if this application support SP-initiated single sign-on, it will also have SAML requests coming out, as well as usually there will be a relay state that comes along with it. And there may be other URL parameters that comes along together with the SAML response, together with the relay state, or some values being part of the relay state. Like these would actually be little information that may be useful down the road. Remember I told you relay state could be used for a landing page, right? And now we don't mess with relay state. We simply pass it back to them. But then there may be some cases that the redirect, when the offender used the relay state, they actually put some URL with some parameters in it. And in some cases, they may have forgotten to encode this so that when the relay state gets passed back, some values got dropped effectively. So when we see things like that, right, that could be a lead to solve that case. Anyway, so the network trace of this whole workflow will tell us that. And of course, with the network trace, we could also tell if service providers redirecting user to IDP at the correct URL, and if we are sending the SAML response to the correct ACS URL. Now, these things will very likely have resolved already because right before we get to this, we would have double-checked the configuration. But still, right, when things don't work, network trace will tell us where they are going, right?
One question on the second bullet that you had, Terry, there about account mapping configuration. Right? Let's just take an example of that username mismatch. Mm-hmm. Is there something in the logs that we can look for that tells us that this is actually related to some parameter or attribute mismatch? Is it evident in the logs, in our logs, or?
Like log files?
Yeah.
That tells us
that it is because of some account mapping configuration.
No. The system wouldn't know, I mean, we wouldn't know what is expected on the other side.
Okay, so it won't be in our logs.
The logs will tell us, and the same thing with network trace, right, will tell us what value we have sent out. Okay. But whether that value is correct or not, that is up to the other side. But we can find out by asking the question, hey, what do you guys use on the other side, right?
Well, normally we'll see this access denied or invalid login. So you don't know if it's username or password. Mm-hmm.
So that's the symptom. If you, and I'll get to that error later on, is that if you see that error saying user does not exist, so right, generally speaking, hey, we can find this user, then this is one thing will pretty much, and for me would be the first thing to look at, right? What do you mean by user doesn't exist? I mean, I know Terry, me as a human, I have a user account in there. But maybe now it is only because the value is, right, it's just different. I'm supposed to use terry.fog instead of the whole email address, terry.fog@centrify.com. Now, but after all these, and if we can still cannot figure out what is going wrong, there are some other things that we could ask on customer side or even service provider side is if they have anything on their end, log file, for example, or even better tools that they have, whatever, that could tell us that you guys actually receiving our SAML response, right? And if you receive it, like, can you guys take a look at it? Or we could actually send out a sample, right, which we extract from a network trace, and then have them look at it and see if they could spot anything wrong, right? Because at that point, in terms of configuration, it's all good. We look at network trace, there's nothing strange from our eyes that we could spot. Then at that point, it's fine to, right, tell them and have their side of support people to work together. But this is pretty much my general troubleshooting procedure, if you will, to always double check the configuration and then account mapping, which honestly is also part of the configuration, and then capture network trace for investigation and analysis.
When we are logging SAML-related JIRA streams, you expect us to be at the point where we are already doing the network trace and COMG, right?
Yes, at least the checking the configuration part. Yeah. Now, why I say that is because, once again, it depends on the symptom, right? Well, it won't hurt. It definitely won't hurt with network trace. But what I said earlier about, if the error is in Centrify, then the network trace wouldn't help much here. You could still collect it, but you won't see much because the workflow has been stopped. Okay. Yep, in the middle. Okay, so far so good?
There's a pop quiz at the end of it.
All right, so let's talk about some possible errors by service provider. So this would happen after, right, Centrify sending out SAML response to this ACS URL, something happens, and if a specific errors would come out, these are some of them. For example, certificate error. Well, this is easy. Certificate error means the signing certificate that they have stored and what we are sending out do not match. So the fix is just to make them match. The other one is user does not exist. So this is the exact one that I just talked about. The name ID value in SAML response does not map to an actual user in service provider. Because we really need to know how service provider map to a user, right? What value do they use? So we have to confirm the username to be used in service provider. More importantly, what format, right? I mean, and then from the AD side, from which attribute is it coming out from? So with network trace, do look at the name ID value. Once again, if you have access to the customer's SAML applications, use the test button. You could use the test button to see what value is coming out before actually making a test run. And if the customer cannot tell for any reason, right, that they don't know what username is supposed to be to go into the name ID value, then, well, we'll have to check with service provider, right? What are you expecting? The third kind would be some kind of message that complains about IDP, entity ID, or audience. Anyone still remember what audience is? It is an entity ID, but what's so special about it? It's an entity ID for the service provider. Okay, SP entity ID, so to speak. So when we see that error, then once again, just look at the value configured on their end as well as the value on our end, and they're supposed to match. Now, for very few numbers of applications, and I really have to say they are exceptions, that they do not have this concept of IDP entity ID and SP entity ID. Somehow to them, they only house one entity ID. And in that case, it's really kind of up to us to decide which one to use, but we do have to ask when they only expect one ID, which one do they expect? And if they cannot answer that question, then we could simply have both entities ID to be the same. Because ultimately, the value has to match, right? And if there's only one value and they have to match, but we have two sources, then we can make two sources to use the same value then. That will be fine too. Okay, invalid name ID format. This wouldn't happen too many times by statistics, but when it does happen, what it means is we have talked about name ID a lot. Now, together with the name ID, there's an attribute that specifies the format. Most of the SAML applications I've worked with simply use the name ID unspecified, and that's why there's nothing else to set in advanced script. But some service provider does enforce using a specific format. Now, when we know them, when we add that application in App Catalog, the name format has already set up for you. Some example name ID format would be email, and the third kind would be transient and persistent, which are rarely used. So when we see a message that complains about name ID format, we have to first know what name ID format is SP expecting. When we know what it is, then we simply go to advanced script and set it. Because the syntax, I can go over this later because this is kind of a different topic. But for the record, the syntax is set name format, and then with the format value. If it is email address, it will be email address. So that's a summary of that. I'll definitely get back to that.
Oh, because normally I think it says format is unspecified, so what if you change to something else? Like format, colon, specified?
Unspecified?
Well, I have on our, like, a SAML, our generic SAML that we did.
Yeah.
When I look at the advanced script and I do a test, right, the results come back with the name ID format. And then it has URN, Oasis, name, so on and so forth. And then
That's right.
name ID hyphen format, colon, unspecified. Is that were you saying that you can specify what the format will be?
Exactly.
Okay. So that would change to something like whatever it is called, whatever you specify the syntax.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Okay, now, so if we got specific errors like that, that would be great, right? We know what the problem, we can go fix it right away. Now, for unspecified generic error, unfortunately, I think that's like half of the cases at least that we see when it comes in. It is like that. So it could be anything that I talked about above, because well, we don't know. So once again, to go through the configuration again and capture network traces to see if anything, suspicious. And if not, then we have to work on their support from their end. All right. What if there's no error message? Single sign-on simply land on a login page and without telling user anything. Well, single sign-on has clearly failed because the user is not in. Actually, in some rare cases, I can tell you that as it turns out, some value is missing. That's why the user is not landed on the destination page. I think some of you have dealt with landing page issue before. But that once again is, go over the configuration. I think I forgot to mention if the service provider side has documentation, we have to read that because there's some special handling that they might have mentioned in the documentation that we might not know upfront. And then the last one, and some of you have seen this, single sign-on redirections are looping between service provider and IDP. So service provider send to centrify SAML request, right? Redirect the user to us. And then, okay, well, we validate the user, it's validated. We redirected the user back to the service provider with a SAML response. But for whatever reason we did not know yet, well, SP sent that user back to us, to the same application. Right? So now the end is the beginning and this loop happens. So if you remember that workflow diagram, right, how the loop can happen is clearly, well, if the destination sends the user back to the beginning of the workflow, that's how this loop is formed. So and there are two flavors of this. The first one is in our SAML application, the ACS URL is actually set to the SP-initiated single sign-on URL, which means that is not the URL that processes SAML response. An SP-initiated single sign-on URL is only a URL that will take you to Centrify, right? So when we set the ACS URL, hey, SAML response go to the SP-initiated single URL, and that's what happened. Now that URL will not care about SAML response, right? It's not its job, right? So that's why that URL will simply send the user back to Centrify, right? So definitely when that happens, look at the ACS URL. Is that the correct one, right? And once again, ACS URL is something that is given by service provider. Either they tell us directly in some documentation or in SP metadata, right? Is something, if we don't know what it is, then we need to find out. We can't really make a guess of what it is. I guess we can try, but when it fails, don't be surprised.
I think that's my problem with my company, Salesforce. I think that you are
NetScale is having that problem right now. That's the call on next. And we actually cannot find out what it is.
We have the code.
Yeah, that's why we're trying to have citrus support to, that may be a different call anyway.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what I want to add one more here is that some SAML application keep this line of scripts, set surface URL. If anyone has looked at it, what that line does is to add a parameter called target, uppercase target, T-A-R-G-E-T, which is a parameter used in SAML 1.0. Now, when some service provider implement their single sign-on, and they also support SAML 1.0, they will actually process this parameter. Meaning, if we left that line there, and say that line is to use the service URL, the ACS URL, they will actually process that URL that might redirect people back to Centrify. Not sure if you guys follow that because that is a kind of complicated case that has happened only 2 or 3 times.
I haven't seen anyone using SAML 1.0.
Yeah, we haven't either.
Oh.
But it's just that their system actually support SAML 1.0 as well. And if we are by chance sending out SAML 1.0 related values, they will actually take that value, they will process that value first, and then not use the rest of the stuff, and that's how it broke. So pay attention to that. Yes?
Since we have like 2 different versions that we can work with SAML 1 and SAML 2,
Mm-hmm.
so is there anything that tells us, like, do we have to go to the application website to see what is that they're supporting, or again, going back to the network trace, when you look at the response and request, that's when you see what is the SAML being used?
It will be something that the service provider will specify. In fact, if they have any guard, any documentation, the first thing we really should see, and people have been doing a good job on that, is to specify that this is SAML 2.0. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, if you guys have no more questions, I'll move on to debug tools. Any questions from offsite?
No.
No. Okay. So now we have some general procedures to what to check. Now, as far as capturing network trace, how do we do that? People who have worked on SAML cases already probably already have these tools, right, installed. But and they will know some good ones too. But I will go through more than just one tool. So in case that we don't have the luxury to download plugin from the internet, there are still tools that we can use. So the first set is, of course, the built-in tool in each browser. And generally speaking, we bring up the developer tool, go to the network tab, start the capture, and then launch single sign-on, either IDP initiated single sign-on or SP initiated, and it will capture the whole trace, and then we can look at the specific piece, SAML response, request, etc. So here in the slides, I will have some steps as to like how you could open the tools, and then the steps to what to do. But let me go through this very quickly because these are things that you can read later on, and I do want to get to the good tool that we use, right? So here's when I'm talking about Firefox, so this is 2 screenshots of the Firefox Web Developer Tool in the network tab, so after the trace is captured, you can see in the screenshot at the top that you will recognize one of the paths will be the IDP login URL, which would typically have the run question mark and an app key, the app key of your application, etc. So that is where we can see SAML requests coming in, as well as when Centrify send out SAML response, you will see the ACS URL that is in the trace. And when you click on it, now below that or next to it, next to that screen, there will be more tabs. And where we can look at the SAML request or response is to go to parameters. You will see that long strings being encoded. Now that is actually the SAML request and response that I showed you in the very first section. It is an XML, but it is in this format when it goes down the wire. Okay. I will tell you how to read that later on. Now Chrome has its own, of course. So navigation might be slightly different, but it's pretty much the same. You bring up the developer tools. For Chrome, it's always capture something, so you don't have to start the capture explicitly. And then you launch single sign-on, and it will capture the good stuff. So here's another screenshot. This one is at Chrome developer tool. So as you can see on the left side, you will see the IDP login URL or ACS URL. Then when you click on it, it will show you the SAML request and SAML response, which is also in that encoder string. IE has its own. Pretty much the same thing once again. Bring it up, launch it. Sorry, bring it up, start it, launch single sign-on, and it will capture everything. Now, what to do with that long string? That is not readable. I mean, I did tell you that there's an XML in there, but how do you get it, right? Now, I found this tool that is pretty handy. So here's the link you could go to there. Here's a screenshot of what it looks like. You can simply, it doesn't matter if it is SAML response or request. You simply copy that string. You go to this site, you paste it in this text box, and then you click on decode, and it will show you the XML content. This tool also, if you ever need, this tool can also encode an XML and give you the string back. So this is what I use. I do have a bookmark of this in my browser. If I ever need to decode a SAML response or request, this is where I go to.
So that's only sending over like the full request, right? Just what's inside the request, not really what happens after.
Response maybe.
Does it have the response or?
Request and response, yeah.
It should have both.
Both, yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't matter which one it is.
Okay.
But now that's a lot of, so that's when we use the browser tool, right? All browser comes with it. You can just use it. This still takes a little time, right? We just have to bring it up. Well, we always have to bring it up, capture it, and then think there's some hand labor here, right? It's to copy and paste the string and then decode it.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, which I didn't show earlier, even after you decode, you see the XML, right? It is still not like well formatted because its job is only to decode it. But it is still hard to read because everything is packed together, right? Yes. Now, there are other tools called XML formatter or XML beautifier that you could see that you could bring this XML to and then make it more readable. So it makes your troubleshooting experience much easier. But still, that's once again another step, right? Is there a tool that can do all of these for us? The answer is yes, there is. There is a Firefox add-on, which is free, called SAML Tracer. The SAML Tracer is the name of the plugin. I don't just mean a tracer for SAML. I can show you, actually, you just search for it. Let me just go and show you, right? If you look for SAML Tracer, and pretty much the first hit you get is the add-on for Firefox. And you just click in it and install it. And after you install it, it will be under Tools, you will get a SAML tracer, and it looks like this. It's a very simple UI. And it always captures traffic too, so you don't have to click on anything. And what's nice about this really is that it will actually detect SAML traffic for you and then mark it as so. So you don't have to eyeball, you don't have to find where your SAML respondent requests are, right? It will show it to you. And also, it comes with the export and import functionality. So for people, right, let's say you and I both use SAML Tracer, you can trace something, you capture that traffic, you export it to a file, you can send it to me. I, in SAML Tracer, import that file, and I can see this exact same trace that you were looking at. So here's some steps that I just showed you really, is to go there, install it. It will be under Tools. It already captures stuff, so you don't have to click on anything. And then when you launch a single sign-on workflow, then it will capture things. Let's actually take a look at it in action. I have some test accounts set up.
I can tell you when you're coming from the user portal, that's capturing a single sign-on with a tracer is probably the most complicated because it opens it in a new tab, and the other tool doesn't necessarily pick up on that page that's been opened in a new tab. It's blank, and then there's like nothing loading.
Exactly. And that's a very good point. Depending on browser, sometimes when you use the network trace tool in the internal tool, when URL changes, they go to another page, the previous logs may get erased. So you might not be able to capture the whole trace. In Chrome, for example, there's the option to preserve log, and that will preserve the previous log even URL changes. But still, this tool will simply capture everything because this plugin is not by tab. It is per Firefox. Meaning, if you do have other things open in Firefox and you capture this, you open this tracer, it will capture some noise. Right? For example, like right now, I'm just going to box.com and it's already collecting things. And my cloud manager, my test environment is doing certain things, pinging stuff, and it shows up here too. Anyway, okay. So yeah, it's another good practice is before I actually launch a single sign-on, let's clear the noise. So he's a test user. So for the existing setup, this is supposed to go to my test environment, Centrify, and then I try to launch that application. And here's the error message that I showed you guys earlier that says subject name is empty or white space. And why it is happening because, yeah, I did mess it up just to show you this message. So now let's say, well, we troubleshoot it and we fixed it, right? And now, but we look at the trace, we can actually see from Box, right? Now this is where I started. And then Box does its own thing internally. This is where it sends a SAML request to us. And now you can see this tracer tool is marking this traffic with the word SAML. And it will, when you click on it, it will give you the SAML tab, right? And before I show it to you, let me show you this first. The parameters tab will show you all other parameters in addition to the SAML request, right? And the relay state. Here's the relay state that Box uses. But now, so what I was telling you guys earlier, with this string, I will have to go to that site and then decode it. And it's still not very well readable. But now with the SAML tab, voila. It decodes it for you as well as it also formats for you. So you don't have to go through all that manual labor just to get it and make it nice. Here you can see directly what is coming in. Right? SAML request and what this is a SP issue or the audience value. right? But now, in this trace, you don't see a SAML response going out because of that error, right? Now, I fixed that error. Let's try again.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
Nick Micah.
Is not available. At the tone, please record your message. When you have finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Nick, pick up. Are you there? Pick up.
Chris, can you still hear us?
We can still hear you. I don't know what's going on.
Wow.
It wasn't me. I don't know.
I muted
Wow.
I think Nick went on mute.
Okay, so we are all still here, right? Except Mike? Except Nick? Okay, so what I just did is, let's say we fixed that error. Now let's go through the same scenario. And right before I launch single sign-on, I clear the noise. We can actually look at how the traffic pops up in the tracer. Okay. Now let me tell you this though. This account is having some password issue at the moment, but when we get to this point, the box actually recognizes this user and knows that this user needs to reset password. Well, don't take my word for it. Look at the tracer. So after box redirects to Centrify, Centrify processes it and eventually sends out a SAML message to box ACS URL. And if you want to look at the response, this is it. All right. So the name ID is the one that I've configured to use. But yeah, it's different from the one that I entered because that was a box email address. Anyway, so here's what you can see in this tracer, right? Coming in and then coming out with the message, decoded for you. And then if you want to share this, then you export this trace to a file. There is some additional option here. We typically just use the default value mask values, and then we'll export to a text file, and then you can send it to your colleagues, whoever also have SAML tracer. If they don't get it, import that file, and they will see the exact same trace.
I tell you a question on the SAML tracing. This is something that we want. Let's say, I have a customer issue that came to me, and I want to work with them and try to capture this. So this is something the customer will have to install on their end. Yes,
and nowadays we really, just because how handy it is, we do always ask them if they let us install it. And so far, in my experience, all of them are pretty flexible, as in they just let us install it.
Yeah. The SAML was just the SAML tracer in Firefox is just enabling an add-on. They have some sort of browser restrictions, but they're okay with that. And then the Google Chrome, that already is there as well.
Yeah.
But then it's the IE debug view. That's a separate install. And you've got to change registry. Sometimes they get a little reluctant, but they do it anyway. For IE.
Because we have to, yeah. But then because, once again, well, I like this tool a lot, right? So I will recommend we try to ask customers if we could install it, because this will save us a lot of time.
Once it's resolved, they can delete it.
Yeah. So this is the SAML tracer, which is pretty much my bread and butter nowadays. And I choose to show you last so that you could appreciate it. There are other network tracer tools such as Fiddler. Many of you already use that. So that will do too. But once again, that will give you the SAML request and response in that encoded string. that we'll have to copy and paste and use another tool to decode it, which is okay. And then now in my experience, sometimes customer actually send us trace file, right? Like before we could get a hold of them and actually run the trace together with them, they might have, you know, they believe that then some trace would help us, and they capture their trace and send us in a .har file. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but I know Google has an analysis tool that could take an HAR file and display all the, you know, the whole trace nicely. So that's another note I want to make. Any questions on debug tools?
I think for me, the most issues that I'm having is locating within the trace where the problem is. Mm-hmm. And I can do the test on what the request is going to be, and I guess figuring out what the response is. But at times it's more complicated to see if it's like if it's a syntax error or if it's if it's an authentication failure. That's one of the common things I see. Mm-hmm. I've kind of figured out, let's figure out what the username, the login, that kind of is the most issue with the attributes. But I do see, like, when their request requires more, mm-hmm. It doesn't, like, maybe like the service provider needs to add additional
attributes. Exactly.
It's unbeknownst to us to try to tell that to the customer, and they don't have that information. Mm-hmm. Either. So it's like we really, even sometimes the service provider doesn't know. You know, like what are your requirements? You know, for single sign-on, really, or for SAML. Yeah. And that's where it would be nice to see a little bit more like granular information in the trace, because it's very generic. Mm-hmm. It just says post with a string, and you know, maybe we'll get invalid or some sort of error, maybe, but not a lot. And if they're using our IDP initiated, and they have that error message URL, then that just says unexpected. Right. And it doesn't say it in the trace what happened. It's our generic login page that just doesn't really tell us what happened.
You're talking about our custom error page, right? Yeah. I'll tell you a little history of that. You remember Salesforce was being like our very first SAML application, and the generic app template was actually based on that, the Salesforce SAML. What happened there is for Salesforce, custom error, an error URL is a required field. That's why we had to make something just to give it to Salesforce. So yeah, you're right, and I agree too. Our error page really doesn't tell you anything besides service provider has said something is wrong. Yeah. That's why it is calling this URL and showing you this page. There has been one case that I've actually, when that happened to a customer, I actually asked them to remove the error URL. I could do that because in that application, Telio is the name. Error URL is actually not a required field. So when I remove that URL and run into the same error, Telio, the application, actually has a better message that's shown on screen. So this is something that you may try in the future when that comes again. If the URL is not required but they're running into it, you can not use it, right, for a while at least. Reproduce the issue and see what the message actually says. Sometimes the message may not be very specific, but it does come with some error code, which sometimes we're able to Google it and found out more. For example, in WebEx. Right. But as far as the tracer go, it could only show us what we are sending out. Of course, we can only do what we know what to do, right? If any SAML attributes are required, all right, let's say there are more attributes that the service provider require, but we don't know, customer don't know, then, well, that wouldn't be something that, that's it because we don't know, right? That's why we didn't set it up front. But with the tracer, we can see what is going out, which means if we do have to contact service provider and show them this, I would be expecting them to tell us, hey, we are missing some attributes, right? Because what is supposed to be there is not here.
So even if it was an additional attribute, you can see that?
Mm-hmm.
It would show like misplaced. Because they didn't specify it in the sample script.
Mm-hmm. That's
really the number one issue. It's the default information, like say if you run an exam.
Mm-hmm.
They forget to set like an additional attribute.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know it should be there, and we don't see that error coming back from the service provider on time.
Exactly. When attributes are missing, it is also in my experience that the error message may not tell you that.
Yeah.
But if that is the issue, then, right, well, the fix is simply adding that. But I think you're talking about is like up front they are missing it and that we don't know.
Right.
And, well, we're all talking about this kind of in hindsight, very well. Now we know what we missed back then.
Yeah.
But up front, if the customer doesn't even know, then they wouldn't be able to tell us. Meaning we wouldn't even know that they need more, right?
Right.
So that is just, I will have to say, kind of the, nature of the beast of SAML application, right? The service provider will really have to tell customers, if not also us, that what are required on their end. So sometimes, if they, for whatever reason, right, forgot to tell them, documentation didn't say it, whatever it is, we don't know, we don't set it, then we will have to, go through this whole troubleshooting eventually just to find out, hey, all the things we know that we need to do, we have done right. That's when we go back to the service provider, right? Now, can you guys tell us what is wrong or missing?
I guess on our side, we could probably do like a learned behavior, and I don't know if the service provider sets these attributes, additional attribute requirements per customer,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's an overall standard, where, like, whatever, I think, I forget, some of them have it where you have to have, like, the first and the last name, like, included in that request, right?
Yeah.
Maybe if it was a standard, then
Mm-hmm.
ready KB and saying, make sure you have these additional attributes included.
Mm-hmm.
Or we could already have them in the template. Maybe
if during integration and development we know that they are required, they will have been there. If not, then, well, it wouldn't be there because we don't know that they are required, right? Which means it could very well happen because the service provider could have made some updates on their side. And if we didn't know, then we wouldn't know to, put them in. Yeah. When we know, we will do our best to add it. Mm-hmm. But in between that timing, right, if a customer is using a new version of the application, which needs some required attributes that we don't know about just yet, then we will have to find out. And well, once we find out, it's easier. Right? Once again, the SAML applications, there are a lot of these configuration parts, but the bottom line is what to set, right? Okay, any other questions for debugging tools, tracers?
Everyone's so quiet on the phone. They haven't talked this whole session.
Terry, this is Ryan. What's your preferred method if we need to escalate? Do you prefer the HAR, or do you want us to break out the SAML request and response into the XML format and provide that? What works best for you?
If you ask me, I would definitely choose SAML tracer first.
Okay.
Just because, right, it's handy, it's easy. most of us already have it. Even customers have it nowadays.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Nope.
All right.